you don't own this anymore, in the sense that like the people whose lives were touched by this and who found other connections through these stories should not now have to vacate this space because you, it turns out, are bad. We're stepping out of the airlock. This podcast is coming out on Friday, April 15th, and it is the same day that the latest Fantastic Beasts movie is releasing in theaters. We won't be covering that just because, you know, I have covered a lot of JK Rowling content over the course of my career, and I've enjoyed it. But I just don't think that I can possibly give her money anymore, or take part in any kind of situation that would potentially give her money, particularly with the kind of climate in society right now towards trans people and the increasing peril and aggressive language that the LGBTQAI community writ large is being faced with.
To get into situations where you're not having the parent, you're hiding things from the parent, you're injecting these concepts about choosing your gender, that is just inappropriate for our schools.
So we wanted to take this opportunity to just talk about other authors, other creatives in the sci-fi fantasy space, with a focus on queer creators, creators of color, just like a more diverse set of sci-fi and fantasy creators. That's what we wanted to do. Do you have any thoughts on the new Fantastic Beasts movie and JK Rowling in general and this whole situation that we find ourselves in?
Yes, I do have thoughts about it. I am exactly on the same page as you. You know, this is something that was a large part of my childhood. I am the age that I was in school and was basically analogous ages to the kids in the books. It was a book series that meant a lot to me. I worked in a bookshop, so I would be able to go to the opening nights when I was still not legally even old enough to really work. It was something that meant a lot to me, but it's something that I now can no longer enjoy. It's something I used to cover. It's part of what my knowledge base is, the same as you, that was part of my career. And there's just, you know what? There's better stories out there told by people who aren't actively harming communities that I love and care about.
And we've also heard from GLAAD, who are calling her tweets cruel and inaccurate. She continues to align herself with an ideology which willfully distorts facts about gender identity and people who are trans.
And we're going to talk about them, and it's going to be amazing. And I feel incredibly lucky to share this space with you, someone who cares about this stuff and understands exactly why we're focusing on something else.
I just think it's terribly alarming, right? Like
it's alarming.
It was. This is not to say that it was not dangerous and potentially toxic, harmful rhetoric previously, but I think like the events of like the last 6 months even just make it feel much more pressing. Something that kind of like actively needs to be pushed back against.
I think the situation is that the reason that it's always been so dangerous is that having prominent figures with huge followings who are seen as respectable or liberal or whatever else saying these things are why these legislations can be brought in.
Or to say it in the words of JK Rowling this past week, all I'm asking, all I want is for similar empathy, similar understanding to be extended to the many millions of women whose sole crime is wanting their concerns to be heard without receiving threats or abuse.
It's why they have the support. It's why people know these terminologies. So it has an active effect that is negative and dangerous and sometimes fatal. And I absolutely agree with you. It's time to push back on it, and it's time to celebrate other stuff that lifts people up and opens spaces for people and changes people's lives in a positive way rather than a dangerous one.
In the realm of books I love that turns out that the author was a shithead, Ender's Game. Ender's Game is like one of
the things I was thinking about.
That is a friend's older brother like recommended it to me, and it like crushed me. Like I was sobbing at the end of that book, and then it became quite clear, like in not recent years, but I would say in the last like 8 years or so, that Orson Scott Card had some really terrible views, particularly on homosexuality and LGBTQAI issues.
Mine was like, this is so funny because you don't really think of him as like a sci-fi author, but one of the first books that I ever really remember that was like deep, and this was when I was a little kid, when I was deep into that felt like you were really going into space is Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator, which is the sequel to Charlie and the Chocolate Factory by Roald Dahl, who it turns out is like a massive anti-Semite. But like when I was a kid, I remember that book. He goes up in the elevator, right, with his family, and they go on they end up on a space station. And that was one of the first interactions I had with sci-fi. But again, you learn these things and then you're like, well, let me find someone else. And luckily there are like a ton of amazing creators who are doing the opposite, who are doing the thing that people have always done with sci-fi, and fantasy, which is to make analogous stories about real world oppression and find like a important way to kind of talk about it.
My personal philosophy is when things like this occur, and particularly with focus on JK's work and the Harry Potter series, which is again a story series, a series of books that I really love, and through which I found a community of like-minded people whose company and relationships I still enjoy. My personal philosophy is like, okay, no more money. I'm not gonna support this. I'm not going to be buying the Legacy of Hogwarts game. I'm not going to be covering the stuff. But when it comes to like what happens, can I reread the books? That one is more. I kind of feel like seizing these works from their author is like a kind of like a revolution. For me, it feels like a revolutionary act of like, fuck you. You don't own this anymore, in the sense that like the people whose lives were touched by this and who found other connections through these stories, they should not now have to vacate this space because you, it turns out, are bad. What should happen is they should then seize this space from you and continue in their cultural relationships, the bonds that they have with the communities they've created, and they should just like seize this story from you. So that's like how I feel about it when it comes to, like, you know, there are chapters still in Harry Potter that I like to read, but I just will never give her money anymore. I just can't.
I think there's a lot of like power in that, and a lot of those conversations. Like Maya Kababe, a really incredible non-binary cartoonist, made a Harry Potter fanzine called Harry Potter and the Problematic Author that really looked at this exact problem. And I think it's really important to have those conversations and to kind of talk about what it means, like, to separate that art from the artist. I mean, I personally don't get any joy out of rereading them anymore, but I used to. There was chapters in Harry Potter that was the only way I could go to sleep as a kid, was to read the chapter where he's on the night bus and he's got the hot chocolate and the hot water bottle, and he's on his way. You know, that was, and it's sad to lose those things, but that's the power of the singular author, right?
Yeah, that's the power of it. Let's move on to just what we're reading and any kind of like stories, authors, wonderful tales, creators that we want to lift up right now. Do you have any recommendations?
Yeah, I talk a lot. There's a brilliant book that I read a lot of YA books that which I guess comes from that legacy of these books that we're talking about that we really enjoy. There's a book I read that I sort of haven't forgotten about, that I've reread a couple of times, called Cemetery Boys by Aidan Thomas. It's trans author, trans lead character, and it is just so wonderful. It's about a boy called Yadriel who wants to become a Bruja and tries to summon a spirit to prove it, but ends up freeing a different spirit. And then it becomes this kind of really dynamic exploration of love and friendship and legacy. And that book is so wonderful. And it's very much to me like the kind of power of when somebody gets to tell a story that represents who they are, but is also just absolutely unburdened and is just allowed to be completely free and adventurous and fantastical. I think that's kind of the power, ironically, that actually a lot of Harry Potter and stuff was missing. Because Harry Potter is like, it takes from a lot of different stories, but those stories were often the same stories that were being told by the same people. So Cemetery Boys is I always tell everyone, just go and buy that book. It's so good. One
book that I read recently that I just absolutely love is The Space Between Worlds by Micaiah Johnson. I think it's her debut novel. And it is a really wonderful here's that word again, multiverse story, high concept, in which people from, let's just call it like Earth 1, travel to various closely related dimensions in order to see, are there any technology that they've developed that can help us like deal with the ecological disaster that our current planet is under, or help us grow food more efficiently, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Is there anything we can learn from these other worlds and glean and bring back to our world? All through that, there is you're left to wonder as you read the early parts of this story, like, okay, but is it happening in reverse? Are there people from the other Earths coming to the... And so all of those questions are things that get answered. It's a really amazing story about class, about race. It is a wonderful sci-fi tale, really like heartbreakingly told. Just a really good book, really surprising, and a great multiverse story that unfolds in a way that you're not expecting.
Mm-hmm. One of my favorite things that I always talk about when people ask about like what's like a good queer comic or what's like a good story that kind of focuses on different kinds of people. Tilly Walden, who is like one of our greatest living cartoonists and who is painfully talented for someone in their early 20s, made this unbelievable hundreds of pages long webcomic called On a Sunbeam, which you can also buy in a beautiful bound edition, but they never took down the free webcomic, which I love. And it is the most sprawling, strange, beautifully illustrated story about these kids on this spaceship and this kind of ongoing journey that's about them and about the journeys they're going on in their relationships, but it's also about the journey of growing up, but it's also just a really cool, weird, quiet space story, but there are elements of magical school fantasy to it. The spaceship kind of grows and shifts, and it's so wondrous. And when you read it, you don't really realize till the end, but there is a very specific focus on a certain kind of character, and there is a very specific decentering of like the usual male heroic protagonist. And it's one of the most sort of subtly radical books that I've read in a long time. And it's also, Tilly's art is so beautiful and intricate. Like, this is one of those comics where you can really go back and just read it a million times and you'll always notice something different.
Next, this is Nicola Griffith's Hild, which I've talked about in various places. From 2013, Nicola is a wonderful writer, queer writer, disabled writer who writes really empathically and wonderfully in just like ways that are completely evocative. There are scenes in Hild that I think about all the time and that I reread all the time because they're just about, like I came to, like, I think a lot of people, comic books and sci-fi and fantasy, because like there's this feeling of like outsiderness. Like you're looking for a place where your own personal strangeness and the way you don't fit, like the pieces about you that maybe don't fit, you're looking for the way, that world where they do kind of fit, right?
Yep.
This is like page 1 of Hild, describing the character Hild, who at this point is a 3-year-old girl. She liked time at the edges of things, the edges of the crowd, the edge of the pool, the edge of the wood, where all must pass but none quite belonged. And that's basically the entire book, is how this character, who is a woman in a world where women are not viewed as having any kind of power and their work is seen as somehow lesser work. There's a great, really evocative, very small moment where like a certain warrior who is having a dalliance with one of the women characters offers to like help her, bring some of the washing in, but as long as it's night and no one will see that he is helping her with like women's work, in exchange for them hanging out longer. Like there's all these little moments that bring you into the power of the people like who are overlooked. And it's just like a really, 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 really amazing book. Really, really amazing book. That's like, there's some great plot turns, really heart like pounding, like suspense and action, but also these really like internal quiet moments about noticing the way people interact noticing the way people treat the main character, notice how they treat each other, notice how they act when they're anxious. It's a lot about noticing, which is what I love about it.
Yeah, there's so much detail. Nicola has an amazing... I love that book so much. And Nicola has another amazing book coming out called Spear, which is kind of this queer Arthurian reimagining. And it's not out yet, so I won't get too deep into details. But it definitely comes from that same space of the edges. Like, we're on the edges, and the journey is to find the other people who are our family, who are also on the edges, to find that community. And I think that's such a powerful thing, kind of about all of these books and what we look for. My next rec is going to be like one of the most... This is one of the books I think about the most that I've read recently, which is called Pet by Akwaeke Emezi. And it is like... This is like the kind of transgressive fiction that I feel like doesn't often get published, but this did. And it is a kid's book, but it's also an adult's book. And it is set in a futuristic world where monsters don't exist, but then a monster escapes out of an artist's canvas, and suddenly this young black trans girl who is the protagonist begins to question whether or not these monsters do exist, and whether or not what the society has done by kind of shunning them. And it's really analogous to all this incredibly deep stuff. And as you read it as an adult, I feel like there's so many terrifying, emotionally wrought layers to it. But it also imagines a world where in, the beginning, a black trans girl is safe. And in that way, it's this incredibly utopian... It's that use of radical imagination that we all talk about a lot. Like, can you imagine... To make a better world, you have to imagine it. And I feel like in a way, Hild does that in a historical way, where it rewrites history and broadens the scope of who was involved, which is just true. Because the people didn't not exist, they were just written out. And Pet does it in a way where it helps us to imagine like a future. And that book I think about so much. I feel like it's one of those books where in years to come, it will become a kind of, I always think about, it's a very different book, but Neil Gaiman's Stardust, that's a book where you could give it to a kid and you could give it to an adult, and two people would read it in totally different ways. And Pet really feels like a great contemporary version of one of those kind of timeless, ageless stories.
And then my last rec, I'm going to go nonfiction. There are a lot of harrowing things going on right now in the news, and it can be like difficult to like process everything. Susan Sontag, the essayist, philosopher, writer, novelist, thinker, wrote a really moving and wise and powerful book called Regarding the Pain of Others. It's really like a long essay. It's kind of a companion to her essay on photography, just like about what it means to like regard images that have been mass produced and moved from different places. And it's a companion in that it posits that in the modern world, like it's never been easier for us to see and engage with images that depict other people's suffering, other people's pain, etc. And so, like, how do we deal with that? How do we sit with that? What do we do? What does it mean if you can't, quote unquote, do anything? Is it enough to just look at it and think about it and feel something about it? I found it very moving and very wise, and it's a book that I think about a lot, all the time, still. And
I'm going to end with, we've talked about, the boy wizard, the boy who lived. It's something we talk about a lot. It's an overarching story of our time. But I have read a book that comes out in May called The Marvelers by Donielle Clayton.
Ooh.
And it feels like it could be and it should be that next kind of cultural phenomenon book.
Oh, wow.
It's a global reimagining of the magical story, like magical school story. It's about a girl called Ella who goes to this Arcanum training academy for marvelers, and she is a conjurer at this school in the sky, but she's the first ever conjurer to attend, and that means that she is the target for people who don't trust her magic, who are suspicious of it. And it is this kind of it's so magical, and it gives you that feeling of walking through the halls, that those magical, cozy feelings you want. But it's also a book that deals with racial integration. It deals with generational trauma. But all the while, it feels like this huge moment for fantasy. Kids from all around the world study at these schools. You know, there's different notions of what it is to be magical and to be from a different place that feels just miles away from the stereotypes of old. And I think it could be a big moment for people like us who love these books, and hopefully for kids who love these books. I feel like The Marvelous could be that book.
Out May 3rd. Really excited for that.